This presentation is going to be about Twine, which is my medium of choice in making games. It's a little different from what you guys do because it's entirely text-based. However, the premises and the methods that I use to make games in Twine are universal, and the nice thing about it is the simplicity of having just text and simple colors and effects to tell a story and make games. Makes it very easy to express what those theories are and what the ideas are behind the various things that I do. Twine is the most beautiful medium I have ever encountered for telling stories. And this entire talk is partially about why it's so beautiful and partially about what I think makes good games and stories. This is Twine. The presentation is built in it. It is universal. What you see right now is, as was clearly displayed, is an HTML web page. So a game in Twine will run on anything that can run HTML, so any browser, any OS, anywhere. Preferably with Chrome, but it works in other places too. It's simple to create. Twine can be created online in moments. It uses a node-based interactive system so that you see one scene as one node leading to one decision tree, and you can actually map out the decision trees in a visual interface that lets you have just a tree that shows you how your story progresses. And it's simple to navigate. You just find the colored twat text, which is a hyperlink, and you click it to move forward. One of my favorite examples of Twine is Queers in Love at the End of the World by Anna Anthropy. You play it, you begin, you have 10 seconds, you're with your lover, you decide to kiss her, softly. You have moments left, you decide to take her hand, you tell her you love her, and everything is wiped away. This is a good example of what Twine is very good at. It's very good at evoking a moment, an experience. It's very good at taking a story, and you could have read that story, and it might have been beautiful and evocative, but by making you engage like that, by making you make those decisions, it shows how much those decisions have weight, how much decisions about how you express affection to people have weight when you have so little time before you're both going to be wiped away. And it's good at moments. One of the limitations of Twine is people started making games like that, and people assume this is the only thing it can do. But it can do so much more. There are three basic premises to Twine games and any games, in my opinion. The first is illumination. Stories, the pictures, are better. Monks in ancient England knew that, and their wisdom passes on to us today. Monks put massive amounts of effort into making these beautiful illuminated manuscripts to make people more interested in the Bible, and it worked. Comics, in my opinion, are the ideal form of human information. The cool thing about images is we immediately recognize them. You see a person, facial recognition, you see their face, how they're feeling. Their body language tells you how they feel, how they're responding to you. Are they aggressive? Are they scared? Are they passive? An image of a chair immediately communicates to you that's a chair. You don't have to tell anyone the details about it because we have the instant visual interaction. The problem with images is there's not a lot of nuance to them. The reason that we have text is we have text to fill in details. We have text to give people the more subtle context, the more theoretical context that we don't get just from seeing things. And the cool thing about comics is that it intertwines those two. It gives us the visual aspect to get that instant recognition, but you have text so that you can give more nuanced messages. And the particular cool thing about comics is that you can do so many interesting things with them. For example, this is a comic made by Scott McCloud, who is famous for doing interesting things and exploring the edge with how you can communicate with comics. And in it, it's a picture of a room, but it's also a picture of a sequence. You go from left to right, and as you go from left to right, you're scanning the room, but you're also moving sequentially through time. So this is an example of how comics can pass through two mediums at the same time, and just one of the many interesting things that you can do with them. And also, we intuitively understand that we're moving through the two mediums at the same time because of the pictures, and we see the emotions because of the pictures, but we see the details of how the people feel and what their relationships are because of the text. There are three aspects to illumination. There's color, which is done very basically in Twine, but can be done in a very complex way in the sort of games you develop. And honestly, that can make things more difficult, because when you have a very busy screen, like in a match 3, where there are a lot of things moving and a lot of things exchanging, then you have a lot of things to juggle. And it can get busy, and the movement forward can be lost. One of the elegant aspects and the simple aspects of Twine is you always have an easy way forward. You press the colored text to go forward. And one of the important things to remember in any game is you always have to give the person playing a cue on how to go forward, what you're supposed to do next. Color is a good way of doing this, but honestly the better way of doing this is animation. Best expressed in the tiny little exclamation point that jumps up and down when someone has a quest to give you, or when a job is finished and you're supposed to click on something. Color, I find, is best for evoking mood, for expressing the basics of how someone feels. Blue for sad, red for angry or passionate. Animation is good for cueing, what am I supposed to do next? What am I supposed to pay attention to? In the ancestral environment, we were conditioned to scan for movement because movement meant predator or prey. It meant threat or food, and those instincts are still with us, and we can monopolize on them to make good games. Last aspect that you can use to illuminate your words, in my case, or your games, is sound, which I haven't explored extensively, but based on what I've done with it, my main anxiety about sound is don't do too much with it, because it's very easy to overwhelm. An extensive soundtrack or an intense score can distract from gameplay as opposed to enhance it. Ideally, sound is elevator music in most cases, but very good elevator music. Illumination. Here are two examples of illumination used well in Twine. Tiny Utopia is a game about someone who is in chronic pain and who wakes up one morning and doesn't feel any pain at all. It is one morning of freedom. It is one morning of peace. And it's about what they do during that morning. And as you see, the color, you've got the bright on that side and the dark on that side, and it's a transition moving up. So the game exists at the crux between darkness and light, which evokes, this happens in the early morning. This happens in freshness. This happens as you are rising. And that very simple color choice very powerfully affects the scenario that this person is trying to express. On the other side of the spectrum, you have Sleepless. Sleepless is a game set in a world where no one sleeps anymore. Humans have just lost the ability to sleep. And it's about 2 weeks after this has happened. So you play someone who hasn't slept in 2 weeks, and people are somehow surviving. And it's chaotic, and it's scratched up, and it's a little hard to read. And that's very evocative of what it's like to be sleep deprived. And it also does a lot of cool, weird stuff. Like, you have these things that you can go to move forward, but like, what's that? There's this thing in the corner of my eye, and it's off-center, and it's weird, and it flickers in and out quickly, and it's like seeing something in the peripheral of your vision moving slightly. You make some more decisions, you move forward, and this is one of my favorite parts. Someone asks the protagonist who you play, are you tired? And it's just so... and eventually it goes away. So those are two ways where you can use illumination in order to evoke a feeling very simply. Interactivity. Interactivity encourages engagement, keeps interest, and it creates disfluency. That screen was more interesting to me than all the other screens because I had to click 2 times in order to get through it. That's the fundamental thing that makes Twine interesting, more interesting than just reading a book, because you have to engage every few minutes. You get more invested because of that simple moment engagement of clicking. The word disfluency is very important here. It's both an aspect of keeping people interested in the game, and it's an aspect of teaching. Disfluency means an obstacle. It is when you are reading something and it's harder. You have to figure something out. Good example. So if I'm just reading a book, then I'm unlikely to remember that page of the book. But if I'm reading a book and this page is in code, and I have to translate that code, I'm much more likely to remember the code that I've translated because it was so hard for me to get there. That's disfluency. Disfluency is the premise for a lot of our teaching techniques. For example, flashcards are a form of disfluency. And Twine, and all games in fact, incorporate disfluency because in order to progress in them, you have to do something. Like, look. Here is an example of basically how that works in Twine. Ash is a story about a person who goes to visit his mother in the hospital, and it's basically just a short story. It's very linear. There are some shallow choices, like you can decide if you see your mom and she's bored or she's calm, you can decide to cheer her up or reassure her, but it doesn't change how the story moves forward. But the thing is, those little choices in the simple act of clicking engage you so much more. And the fact that you get the story just a bit at a time engages you so much more and gives you more investment than if this were just a short story. Ease. Now this is where Twine really shines in a way that doesn't really apply to you guys, because well, you're working with technology that's a lot more complex. So if you wanted to use Twine for anything in your lives, it's cool because it's very simple to learn. If you know JavaScript, or hell, if you know any scripting, you know Twine already. And if you know JavaScript, you can do anything with it. It's infinitely expandable because it's based in JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, so if you know that, you can do anything with it, which I have done so much to my detriment because I've hacked it apart to the point where when he updates it, I sometimes get myself in trouble, but that's the price you pay. And it's utterly portable, like I mentioned before. If something runs a web page, then you can run your Twine game on it. And the nice thing about Twine that might apply to you guys is that it's super easy for prototyping things. You don't need any imagery, you don't need any anyone else. You don't need any complex programming languages. You don't have to commit yourself to how you're developing a specific game. You can just toss some game mechanics into a HTML file and see if it works. And I've used it to very quickly prototype in specific games for ARGs, which are alternate reality games, if you've ever heard of them. I've obviously used Twine to make games. I live action roleplay all the time, and I've used Twine to make challenges in live action role-playing games. For example, a year ago, we had a Battlestar Galactica LARP, and there was a big screen which had the status of the ship currently, and I had a Twine, not quite game, but display system up there, and it had like navigation on, engines on, life support not on, which is a problem that they had to solve. And it was structured so that there was some game-like mechanics they had to interact with in order to get life support back on. And they had to go around to different places and talk to NPCs and get codes in order to get that on. And it was really easy to mock up that interface, which made it so much more realistic because they were actually interacting with a system on the computer, and Twine made that possible, and in fact, quite easy. And that's the three aspects. And bringing it around to my game, which is open sorcery, which is my baby, my darling, and I think it's good, obviously, and this is why. Because it's a game that incorporates meaningful choice. Players are not always smart, but fundamentally perceptive. It's a funny thing, because players as a general concept can be very thick-headed, because you think this is so simple, they're definitely going to get it. I mean, it's so obvious to me, and no one gets it. But at the same time, people have a very powerful, intuitive understanding of when they actually are making a difference. If you have a shallow choice, they can tell. They can tell if your choice, they can tell that whether a decision to pick the pink dress or the blue dress, they can tell that's not going to have long-reaching complications. They can tell if their interaction with an NPC is going to actually affect how that NPC feels about them. And if you can communicate that their choices matter, that their choices are going to have serious ramifications into the state of the world that they've invested their time in, that's going to matter to them. That's going to make them feel powerful. It's going to make them feel invested in what you've created. And that's so super important. Almost as important, because it's fleshing out the world that you're trying to invest them in, is real characters. There is a dearth of that in this industry, and if you make real characters, people will notice. And it's scary to make real characters because you have to expose something about yourself that's real. You have to put a piece of yourself, rip it out, and put it out into your art. And that sounds a little pretentious, but it's just true. And if people see that, they'll respond to it and they'll care about it. And that creates the investment you want, and that creates the investment that you care about, and will lead them to care about making meaningful choices because they'll care about the characters. And the last thing I think that is, two last things, I think that's important about any game is Hemingway shortness. You have to have brevity. If you have text, you have to make it quick, you have to make it preferably punchy, and you have to make it to the point. Because people don't have a terribly long attention span. We live in a culture of memes. And honestly, that's not terribly a bad thing, because quality writing is succinct and contains a lot of information in an elegant and constrained package, and that is an ideal to strive towards. And the last thing that I think is super important is an extremely simple UI that always leads you forward onto the next thing. In Match 3 games and mobile games, this is often achieved through a quest log that you're constantly drawn back to, generally through animation. In Twine, it's achieved through always having some colored text off text that you can click on in order to move to the next thing. But regardless of how complicated you are, and regardless of the cues that are in your toolbox, it has to always be clear how to move forward, and preferably everything else should be intuitive. It's so much more important to be intuitive than it is to be pretty. And that's my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
What's the most complicated stuff in doing Twine games? I mean, aside of shortness, that's obvious, because no one wants to read a lot in simplicity.
Do you mean complicated in terms of programming or complicated in terms of game design?
Yeah, game design.
It depends hugely on the game, because asking what's most complicated in Twine is kind of like asking what's most complicated in game design with Unity. I can tell you what's most complicated about making my game in particular, Open Sorcery, and that was because meaningful choice was so important to me. The storyline had to branch in a lot of different and disparate ways. Like, it had to really matter whether or not you killed the poltergeist in the first scene. And keeping track of those variables and how they changed every sequential scene, that got very complicated. And in fact, I have a lot of branching mind maps, and had to go through a lot of beta testing in order to make sure I didn't break the game with all the complexity I had in there.
And how do you measure the, how do you understand that you, how can you push players to do something, like make Twine game more complicated for players, or
challenging?
Yeah, put some challenges in game aside of timers, because okay, I got to do some decision until the bombs explode, but something different.
I can talk about that from the perspective of puzzle games. There are two game mechanics in Open Sorcery. The first is puzzle-based scanning problems. Basically, you are told, you're a firewall, a magical firewall, a fire elemental bound with C++ code, and you have to scan for other spirits that are causing problems. So you have to, and you can't see them initially, so you have to look at the environment and see what effect they're having on the environment. Are they causing wetness? Are they lighting things on fire? Well, then they're probably a fire spirit. Are they causing messes? Are they killing things? Well, then they're probably a chaos or a death spirit. So you have to figure that out and decide what the matter and the motive is. So that's investigative gameplay, and that's highly interpretive because you have to write out descriptions that cues the player into answering the puzzle of what's the matter and motive. The macro gameplay, which is the overall challenge of the game, is deciding how to develop your character over the course of the game, which will determine what choices you get in subsequent scenes. So those are the two ways that I challenge my players. I create minor puzzles that depend on reading comprehension, honestly, and I create overall sequential puzzles of combination that is fundamentally linked with the plot of the game, because in making decisions about what your character can do, you make decisions about who your character is. Did that answer your question?
Well, more or less. So I got to read a lot of text just to have the right answer and choose the right direction, pick the red pill or the blue pill, depending on what was written about.
Fundamentally, how to challenge your players depends on what kind of game you're making. So if you're making a puzzle game, make good puzzles, and make a variety of puzzles, in my opinion. But that's not hard and fast rule, because honestly, like on Skates, there is one puzzle and it's iterated upon infinitely, but it's a fun puzzle, so it works.
Everyone really wants to ask which more complicated mechanics can be created with this framework. Like, obviously we can choose different answers and go to branches, but maybe is there a possibility to somehow make things more how do you do puzzles, basically?
Generally, I program them in JavaScript, or I do them. So in the game I'm developing right now, which is called C++, I have a tarot deck game that, say the question again, please.
Well,
I want to make sure I'm
actually,
answering
you
what
already
you're asking.
answered, because
Okay.
we talked about that you don't need any skills in programming, that to create some complicated mechanics, you actually need something like this.
Actually, no, I'm going to change that. You don't, because Twine has a native scripting language that can do some pretty robust complexity. So as long as you're comfortable with your game just having text in it, you can do some pretty interesting things just with the scripting. But if you want to make interesting puzzles that involve, the thing about Twine is every time I click on one of those hyperlinks, it loads a new page. So if you want a puzzle that involves not loading a new page, like if you want to drag and drop or do more complex things, then you've got to go into JavaScript. But as long as you're willing to go through that loading every time, yeah, you can do simple puzzles or even very complicated puzzles just with the scripting.
You've been talking about character development, like during your story, and what the type of or methods you use to show players what character they develop, like in the end, some kind of summary, or just they just finish the story and that's it.
I hate summaries. That's not quite true. How to show character development? Well, for me it's kind of easy because my character is a program and she has a UI status screen that states her current attributes, like what matters and motives she's incorporated into, and she has a score for how good she is at dreaming. So to a certain extent, character development is constantly viewable from the status screen. But that's a little artificial. How I really feel like character development should be displayed and is organically displayed is in changing her interactions with the various NPCs. In order to view who someone is, you have to see how they interact with other people. That's the most fundamental telling point of a character, in my opinion. You can do it to a certain extent from exploring, particularly if you're writing from first person or monologuing, you can express how they're developing in terms of the word choice that they use and what they focus on. And that can be a useful tool, like Shakespeare did it, so it has to be a good idea. But fundamentally, how they interact with other people is the important part.
Speaking of meaningful choices, I guess it means some branches. Does it end up in some variables or just separate trees of content?
That's a good question. Twine is set up intrinsically to want you to branch in terms of its nodes. Let me show you Twine, because that will help express this. But I prefer to do it in terms of variables, because that makes it a more condensed experience, and that means I can do more with the variables, because they can be strings. So I can, like, instead of having, are you going this way or this way, I can have it be like, the snack in your pocket is turkey or lettuce or a possum. And I prefer the flexibility that variables give.
No.
We're not secure. Oh well, I guess we can't see Twine. Any more questions?
Yeah. How the workflow on branch narrative? Do you start from like a dominant path and then add secondary branches, or do you have from the beginning scope of the tree or some, I don't know, graph-like metrics? How do you work with it?
A little bit of both, honestly. Oh, thank you. I tend to like to have a sense of what the big branches are going to be, and I like to have multiple large sweeping ways that you can go. And have that general outline from the beginning, but I feel like it's very important as you're developing the game for you to be open to the possibilities that crop up as you're creating. Yay! And to rigorously, religiously adhere to the original outline is, in my mind, a mistake, because you're going to discover more about your game as you start to make it, and it's important to be open to what your game is telling you it needs to be.
So you like let the flow take you.
Exactly. But like, don't let the flow take you too far, because then you'll never finish your game.